Hello, my name is Mary Lee Clark, and I am co-president of the League of Women Voters Jackson area. I welcome you to our online 2020 candidate forum featuring candidates for Jackson County Sheriff. These candidates will be on the ballot in the November 3rd general election. This year, the League is celebrating 100 years of expanding voter rights, educating voters, and shaping and influencing legislation at local, state, and national levels. The League is a national organization. It's nonpartisan, non-political, and a civic organization that encourages informed and active participation by all citizens in government. This works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and seeks to strengthen and broaden knowledge about our form of government and democracy. While the League does not support any candidates or parties, we do take stands on issues we have studied. One of the League's most important roles is to assist voters in making informed choices at the polls, and thus we bring you this candidate forum. Recordings of this event, whether they be in person or of a computer screen, may not be used without the express written approval of the League. The League will only allow audio video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by the media reporting on the event. Our moderator this evening is Gwen Tabb, who will explain the format and get us started. Gwen? Gwen, you're muted.
I am so sorry. Let's do this again. Thank you, Ms. Clark. I am Gwen Tabb, and it is my honor to introduce the candidates for Jackson County Sheriff, Mr. Joseph Beeman and Mr. Gary Schutte. Invitations were extended to all candidates, but despite multiple attempts to communicate, there was no response from tonight's absent candidate, Ms. Cochran Toops. We thank you for participating in the candidate forum this evening, and now I want to review some of the basics of the format. Each of you will have 90 seconds to make an opening and closing statement. Candidates are asked to speak only of themselves and their ideas, with no disparaging remarks about opponents. Time will be kept by a member of the League of Women Voters. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer each question. You will be alerted by a sound that was previously shown to you at 15 seconds remaining. And when your 90 seconds is ended, you will be allowed to end your sentence and are expected to stop at that point. As the moderator, I will interrupt a candidate who exceeds that time limit. The order of the open and closed statements will be alternated, and questions will be alternated alphabetically. The questions that I will ask you have been obtained from members of the Jackson community prior to this candidate forum. Candidates are asked to manage muting themselves throughout the forum. That includes me. Okay, Mr. Beeman, you will be first. Candidates are not given forum questions ahead of time. However, the League has informed each candidate that the first question will be used as an introduction, and they will be provided the following. Please take 90 seconds to introduce yourself to your intended constituency, explain your reasons for running for sheriff, your background, and how it will help the Jackson community. Mr. Beeman?
Thank you very much. I think the first thing I'd like to say is I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters again for inviting me to this forum. I know the great work that the League has done throughout the years, and I certainly appreciate that. Again, my name is Joe Beeman. I'm the independent candidate for sheriff. I'm a longtime Jackson resident. Graduated from Jackson High School in 1988 and Spring Arbor College in 1995. I'm a current employee of the Michigan Department of Corrections. I'm a former Interstate Compact Deputy Administrator, as well as an IED Administrator for the department. I'm currently a institutional parole agent that works in our offender success section. of the department, working towards connecting individuals that are being released from prison to services and other resources that can help them be more successful back in the community. Why am I running for Jackson County Sheriff? I'm running for Jackson County Sheriff for at least 3 reasons. The first reason is that I love this community. I've been in this community for a very long time. I've worked heavily in the community. I sit on several boards, as well as have participated in numerous volunteer events around the county. I really would like to also remove this negative cloud that's been hovering over the Jackson County Sheriff's Department for the last few years, because they have such great employees there, such great line staff, and such great jail workers. I know as a parole agent, I worked with the county jail staff on a number of different things, and they just have a lot of great staff. So those are the main reasons why I'm very interested in being the Jackson County Sheriff. Thank you.
Mr. Schutte.
Thank you, ma'am. My name is Gary Schutte, and I am a lifelong resident of Jackson County. I have 4 kids. I'm married, happily married for the last 25 years, and 3 of my kids are adults. One's at MSU Law School, one's at MSU undergrad, and one just graduated from U of M and is preparing to go to PA school. My youngest is in high school at Hanover Wharton. As I said, I'm a lifelong resident here of Jackson County, and I'm a 25-year retiree of the Jackson Police Department. There, I spent 18 years as a detective. I specialized in gangs, guns, and violent crime. During that time, I was also placed on a violent crimes-related task force with the Department of Justice, working there for a total of 8 years. During my tenure in violent crime, Jackson saw a rare murder-free year. There was a tremendous decrease in shootings, and there was a lot of positivity happening in the community. My education includes both a bachelor's degree and a law degree, and currently I'm a practicing attorney with White Hotchkiss and Fallahy. In my law practice, I have worked in criminal defense. I've worked in defense of indigents in the juvenile system. And in addition to that, I've worked in local prosecution. So I've had an array of experiences that I believe give me a depth and understanding of law that no other candidate can explain. My experience as both a detective and a lawyer, I believe, provide me with a unique background into law enforcement and will assist me in making Jackson. Ma'am, I can't hear you.
Mr. Schutte, will you be you'll be first. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Okay. What budget experience do you bring to this position, and how would you handle a budget shortfall, yet continue to maintain services?
So I was the president of the Hanover Wharton School Board, and we had a lot of unique challenges in budget in different types of situations in schools. I was intimately involved in that, was on the personnel committee, and understand and have worked with budgets quite a long time. I've also been involved with a lot of different federal task forces that utilize budgets from different grant money that was provided to the departments. I've had an opportunity to work with budgets immensely. And in addition to that, I also was on the Hanover Village Council and was intimately involved in creating that budget as well. Now the Jackson Sheriff's Department is looking at about an 8% budget downfall in the coming year because of COVID. And as a result of that, I believe that the best way to handle that is first to look at what areas we would be able to eliminate that wouldn't affect personnel. And in so doing, I believe there are 5 different positions that haven't been filled at the Sheriff's Department that could eliminate approximately $450,000 to $500,000 in funding. That would then decrease the 8%, which is estimated to be $920,000, to about a $400,000 budget shortfall. Then with equipment and other areas, we would be able to reduce that without getting into personnel. Now, if it did get into personnel, I would suggest that we would start looking at a furloughing in order to make up the additional budget shortfall and still provide the best services for Jackson County. Thank you, ma'am.
Same question. Do you need me to repeat it?
Yes, please, if you would.
What budget experience do you bring to this position, and how would you handle a budget shortfall, yet continue to maintain services?
Sure, absolutely. Most of my positions with the Department of Corrections is kind of a reactionary position to budgetary issues that are basically handed down by the director of our department. So typically what the director is going to do is she's going to ask us to look in areas and then try to figure out where we can ultimately make cuts within our own areas. So my experience with the exact budgetary experience from my current employment is not very much, quite frankly. As I've been serving on the Jackson County Parks Board for the last 6 years, we've been going through many budgetary issues as it relates to refurbishing the Cascades Park, or seeing how we're going to get new playground equipment and other items like that. Again, my board does not have fiduciary responsibilities over these particular issues. So basically what we do is we review what the county commission is dealing with, and then we also take advice from the county controller as well as the county administrator's office to try to make determinations as to what we have money to spend on and what we don't. Fortunately, the citizens of Jackson passed a millage for the Jackson County Park System, which basically fully funds our parks. So it's just important for us to manage that particular money when we're looking for grant funding and other things like that. As far as what the budget is, I don't really think there's a great mystery to it. The Sheriff's Department budget is a line item budget. And those I've looked at and I've definitely reviewed. I've got a bachelor's degree in business administration. The first 10 years of my career were all in finance. I worked for Comerica Bank, Citizens Bank, and I did a lot of work in finance with ABC International, with an import-export company. So I'm familiar and comfortable with the accounting principles that are put forth in budgets. Dealing with the budget is a completely different issue. It's difficult for me to, ahead of the game, try and make decisions on where I would make cuts or where I wouldn't make cuts. So what I really like to do is I like to say, from a conscientious standpoint as the sheriff, I would sit with my command staff, with everyone, and I would also partner with our county administrator and controller's office to sit down and kind of go through the budget and see where changes could be made and where they can't be made. We can always do furloughs, we can always change full-time employees, we can always look at benefits, but without I don't.
Okay. You were frozen for a second, but you're back. Right. Mr. Bean, this question will go to you. What measures would you recommend to ensure that the law is enforced in a manner that is humane and just to all?
I think that's the question of the day. As we look really throughout the country and what's enforced. There are many policies and procedures right now that are currently enforced that clearly need to be reviewed. Use of force is a policy that jumps to mind. Examining use of force. Other things that people are kicking around are community oversight committees, or having some type of oversight over when when a death occurs, or when an officer discharges a weapon, or if someone perishes while they're in the custody of law enforcement. So there's a lot of language being kind of bantered around right now as to how we would ultimately solve problems like this. I think for me, I would start with use of force. I would also start with working with the community advisory committee and work with our staff to try to figure out what real policies directly affect the application of use of force when officers are making arrests, or quite honestly in the jail system, if something happens in the jail system and there's a fight between inmates, or there's an assault on staff, or an assault on a contractor, or assault on someone in the jail system, how are those things ultimately being dealt with? So I think there's going to be a lot of discussion coming down the pipeline from our legislature with guidance on these, seeing how we seem to be inundated every day with a new case of some form of questionable use of force that's being done by law enforcement. But we also have to look at ourselves as citizens and think, how are we reacting to things? Thank you.
Would you like to have the question repeated, Mr. Schutte? Unmute. You need to unmute.
Excuse me, no, ma'am. I think I understood the question.
Okay.
So if the law is enforced humanely and just for all, that is the absolute pinnacle of law enforcement. It should be framed in such a way that justice is blind, much like what we see in the statute of the blindfolded lady holding up the balancing act. So in this case, it is important to have and engage with the community. And one of the things that I believe we ought to institute is a community review board. And we look at a community review board to both examine our policies and to look at instances of where an application of force has been made that is questionable. So if the community review board is involved in being a stakeholder with the application of force, with bringing about the actual policies of the application of force, and then they also understand the force continuum and how that works in law enforcement and how that is applied, then I believe what will end up happening is people will have buy-in to it. And when a serious incident does happen, because eventually and unfortunately they will happen, that we can have buy-in by the community and everybody will understand why the officers react in the way they do. Unfortunately, right now, in a lot of situations, what we're seeing is people simply don't understand why the police are reacting and taking measures that seem so drastic in everyday life. But in fact, they're doing so as part and parcel to a force continuum that allows them to take one step further than the force that's being offered against them. So I think if we have that general understanding, we have the community buy-in, we have the community review board that's able to look at everything and apply it in a uniform manner, then everyone will have confidence in the police. Thank you.
Mr. Schutte, the next question goes to you first. Given the concerns over the use of excessive force against minorities by some in law enforcement, how do you plan to address the use of excessive force?
Well, use of excessive, I'm sorry. Use of excessive force by minorities is no different than use of excessive force by a majority group. If it happens, it needs to be dealt with accordingly. Now, depending upon what the force is, what the situation is, and how that instance came about, it'll have to be dealt with on its own individual basis. For instance, if somebody is beating another person that happens to be a part of a minority group, then that person needs to be suspended immediately, an investigation needs to be conducted, and the appropriate punishment needs to be handed down onto that person, as well as whatever prosecution needs to be remedied in the middle of it. Now, what I think has really been a problem, especially with minority groups, has been transparency. And there hasn't been any of that going on, fortunately, in this community. But as we see it around the country, we have a real problem with transparency. There's been a lack of allowing the videotapes to be played. There's been a lack of the investigation information being released. There's been this cloud of secrecy over the investigation. Now, some of that is important and done for a just reason because they don't want the investigation to be tainted. But it's also important to understand that the optics of what's going on in the community also need to be addressed, because the police derive all of their power from the community. So I think what we need to do is address it from the standpoint of we're all in this together, and it's not our side against your side. And once we are able to do that, I think we'll be successful in having these types of situations decrease.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to have the question repeated, Mr. Beeman?
Yes, I would. Thank you.
Given the concerns over excessive force used against minorities in some law enforcement, how do you plan to address the use of excessive force?
I'm sorry, I'm near the airport and there's a plane flying over.
Oh,
I apologize for that. I guess how I would answer the question is when we're saying excessive force used against minority communities, and the perception of ultimately what that is. I think my take on it is it's slightly different. When this is a cultural phenomenon that is a result of a long complicated history that we have here in the United States between the majority group and then minority groups, inside it. And I think that, clearly by what we're seeing on the news and what's ultimately been is, ultimately what's disseminated to us by the media, makes it appear, there's a lot of moving parts as to what's happening. Clearly, if any human being is being arrested and excessive force is used, then the full force of whatever the policy violation that individual is doing, as well as any legal violation that individual is doing, must be addressed immediately and up and to, if we're reading policy, up and to dismissal of that person, up and to criminal charges being brought against that particular person. But when we're talking about how do we address it, how do we really fix it? In my estimation, that's the job of the chief law enforcement officer of the county, which in this case is the Jackson County Sheriff. That sheriff must lead. He must lead and have people understand that there's all these different communities in it, but they're all equal under the law. And as long as we lead that way and we live that way, then we can fix that problem.
thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Beeman, you'll be first for this question. How would you ensure that appropriate interventions by officers would happen? Should excessive force be used by other officers?
We've got to break down the code of silence. The code of silence exists in this arena for a variety of different reasons. You have to understand from my perspective, as a correctional employee and who was at one time an officer, you want to make sure that the people that you're working with have your back, quote unquote, have your back. That's ultimately what is happening. And it turns into ultimately almost a us against them mentality, where it's, well, you saw what that person was doing, so it's important for you to ultimately back that person up. And that extends to any form of law. It extends to any opportunity where human beings interact with individuals, where it's a team, whether it's baseball or football or whatever it is. You back your team up no matter what your team is doing. So the question is, how do you get beyond that? And I truly believe it's through professionalism. The issue with law enforcement is professionalism. It's about being professional. We're law enforcement, any form of law enforcement is under high levels of stress, high levels of trauma. And when you show up, it's difficult when someone is yelling at you and screaming at you out of your name, spitting on you, assaulting you, verbally battering you physically, to not respond in the human reaction, which is violence, is ultimately what comes out of us. So if we can focus on professionalism, being the best professionals that we can be, then we will resolve a lot of that issue.
Thank you. Mr. Schutte, would you like me to repeat the question for you? You're on mute, please.
Sorry. No, ma'am.
The hardest thing is the muting and unmuting.
That's exactly right. No, I don't think I need you to repeat it.
Okay, go ahead.
So I think it comes down to a question of duty. The police have a duty to protect people. And when I look at custody, I think of it in terms of the law. And when you look at custody, for instance, think of a parent with having custody over their child. When you have custody over your child, you have to take care of your child. You have to make sure that they're fed. You have to make sure that they're that they have a roof over their head. You have to make sure that they're safe. When a police officer takes someone into custody, they have those duties as well. It transfers over to them just like that. So all of the police officers that are involved in a situation where somebody is taken into custody have a duty to make sure that that person is safe. And they have a duty, just like a parent has a duty against another parent. If they were to harm their child, the other officer has a duty to make sure that the other officers are taking care of the prisoner that's in their custody. So that's what it comes down to, and it's very simple. And quite frankly, if they're not affecting that duty, it's either malfeasance or it's misfeasance. They're either maliciously doing it or they're choosing to look the other way. And perhaps it is, like Mr. Beeman said, perhaps it is something, a code of silence or some sort of code. Well, you know what? I've been in law enforcement for 27 years. I was in law enforcement, 25 as an officer, 18 as a detective. And quite frankly, I think that's a terrible argument for an officer to make, that there is a code of silence. I don't buy into that, and I don't think it's right. And I would enforce, and I would encourage all of the deputies that work under me to report any kind of misfeasance or malfeasance of duty that occurs on their watch. Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Schutte, this next question goes to you first. What approach would you put in place to measure racial equity issues and to provide the Jackson community with transparency related to the entire Sheriff's Department?
So I think the first thing that needs to be done in terms of transparency and equity involving racial divide is that policies and procedures that aren't related to investigative tactics need to be displayed so the public can review them. In terms of making sure that we are equitably enforcing the law through the community, I think statistics are important. I think they need to be used and displayed on the county's website. But also, I think it's important for the sheriff to be engaged with the community. For instance, going to church with people, different churches, and talking to people and different types of social gatherings, and being involved in the Rotary Club, the Knights of Columbus, or different things of that nature, so that they have their finger on the pulse of the community as far as to what's going on. And also, there needs to be some sort of blind way of collecting data so that we can make a determination as to whether or not we're being whitewashed with information that's coming in through those other channels that I've just spoken of. And I believe that that needs to be conducted either through a directed survey, and what I mean by that is people actually calling and making the survey, or calling and asking survey questions, or having a survey posted at the Sheriff's Department that can be filled out. Thank you.
Mr. Beeman, would you like the question repeated?
You know I would.
Okay, no problem. What approach would you put in place to measure racial equity issues and to provide the Jackson community with transparency related to the entire Sheriff's Department? Sure.
Racial equity is once again, it's another interesting topic that is definitely moving to the forefront of what's happening. You know, what is racial equity? Racial equity is that there should be basically the same number of minority individuals on your force, on your police department, or in your sheriff's department that is reflective to the community. That would be the equitable solution. There would be a proportional number of individuals. But the other issue is that then the relationship, the perception of individuals from a particular community, right, towards these particular departments in which we're seeking equity. I unfortunately had the displeasure of attending a recruiting session for the Jackson Police Department at the Martin Luther King Center, where there was not one minority individual that even showed up to even talk with the chief of police who I think is doing a great job trying to reach out to communities and doing things. But I feel like it takes more than that because of this long process. So it really is about the community. And as far as transparency goes, there's applications and things like that that can ultimately track like human resource information if we have complaints about police or other issues like that to ultimately deal with. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Beeman, you'll be first for this next question. There has been much recent discussion about the inequities in our current court system relating to pretrial incarcerations. As an example, do you feel the issues of bail determination should be reformed? And are there other things that should be looked at?
We should absolutely be reviewing jail reform. Actually, there's a software company in Ann Arbor called Matterhorn Court Solutions. They offer a program that can help courts establish whether or not cash bail is appropriate or whether or not a personal recognizance is appropriate, as opposed to continually leaning on the bail bond system. I'm not a huge fan of the bail bond system here in the United States, quite frankly. I think one, it goes against the Constitution's concept of what the purpose of bail was. So I would say absolutely yes, we need to ultimately look at the bail system to see how and definitely how it's being applied court to court. As it relates to creating difficulties, I mean, also part of my platform is absolutely kind of a reform process at the district court level when we're talking about where interventions, where can we actually move in to try and divert individuals from their criminal behavior or their criminalistic ideas and processes, whether that be their substance abuse issue, a mental health issue, whether that be poverty, whether that be lack of employment or being undereducated. So I would absolutely want to look at the bail bond system here in the county and how it's being applied and to whom it's being applied to.
Would you like the question repeated, Mr. Schutte?
No, ma'am. Thank you. So I understand the problem with bail, and bail reform is absolutely needed. It's interesting to look at the federal system in terms of bail, and I would like to see something like that mirrored in the state system. So for instance, what happens in the federal system is there's a bond hearing once a person is arrested, and a determination is made as to whether or not they are a threat to society, quite frankly. I mean, that's the biggest portion of what it's looked at, and I think that's the important part. Are they a threat to society, and are they going to, in fact, be involved in additional criminal activity that's going to harm someone? If they are, then they likely need to continue incarceration. If they're not, they should be released. That is one of the problems that we have in our system, is that people get locked up and they aren't able to afford to be able to prepare for an accurate defense as to what has occurred to them and caused them to get locked up, and they just stay in jail. And ultimately what ends up happening with those folks is they get less of the justice system than folks who are released. So we have to make sure that we take a really long and hard look at what the criminal system involves and then allow it to be reformed. And in fact, I'm all for it, especially as a sheriff's candidate, because that's going to release stress on the jail and it's going to lower inmate populations. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. And Mr. Schutte, this next question goes to you first. What new methods or technologies would you propose in order to prosecute crime more effectively?
So the first thing that I would like to see is more intelligent-based policing. And some of the technologies that we can use for that include databases that include in the jails security threat groups that can be available to all the police officers that are working in the street. So for instance, when somebody is brought into the jail on a particular crime and they're providing intake information as far as to where they live, who they live with, and stuff like this. we can collect additional data as far as to where they're at and who they might be hanging with, especially if they're involved in gangs. Now, why this information is so critical is because it can be utilized to understand, number one, security inside of the institution, so you're not putting people from opposite ends in the same areas where they can hurt one another. And also, if they're out on the street and they're involved in criminal activity in a particular area that we know that they're frequenting, we have a place to start when we have these shootings that occur right now in a particular neighborhood or in a particular area, and we don't know where to begin. We can utilize this as far as for people that we need to look for, people to see in the area who may have problems with other people. So that's an example of how intelligence-based policing works, and that's some of the technology behind it is really critical, and utilizing it so that we can do it without just going out and throwing a blanket over a particular area and stopping everyone that might be on a street corner and doing these no-nonsense stops. If you do it systematically and you're doing it intelligently, it can offer tremendous rewards for solving crime. I just don't believe in going out and making blanket arrests to try and stop a problem in an area. And if you use these intelligent portions, and I'm giving you only a small snapshot, an example of what that means, but if you use this, it works really well. There's also additional technologies that can be utilized. There's the gunshot. In addition to that, you can use cameras and things of that nature, but I have a problem with that from the standpoint is it tends to go into privacy of individuals. But in particular areas, it might be useful. Thank you.
Okay, same question, Mr. Beeman. Would you like it repeated?
Yes, please.
What new methods or technologies would you propose in order to prosecute crime more effectively?
To prosecute crime more effectively. So I'm actually not, we were talking about prosecuting crime. I think that goes directly to the enforcement piece of it. So, absolutely, we're going to use enforcement measures to go out, and we want to arrest people, and we ultimately want to prosecute those people because we want the evidence to be good. We have an example that, in Gochenar right now, AG Nessel just came out, and there's a problematic case out in Blackman Township and Leone Township regarding the seizure of a firearm in a motel. And so, to me, those kind of are processes. I think the best technology to use when we're talking about making sure that officers and that are out doing the frontline work, the real work, or the detectives that are actually digging down and interviewing people and doing things is to let them use their human skills. Is ultimately the best technology. I would databases and statistics I think are wonderful tools as well. But the core of it comes to the person's ability to effectively communicate. Say 90% of everything that we do, everything that we're going to try to investigate, is really going to come down to the person's ability to communicate, as well as the other information that they have. When you're conducting an investigation and you're receiving intelligence, and then you're interviewing an individual, you have an opportunity to kind of throw things out there to see what they know and see what they don't know. So for me, it's about investing in the deputies or the detectives or whoever it is that's doing the work, investing in them to make sure that they have the skills and the tools that they need when they're out in the field working with people to be able to effectively communicate, effectively extrapolate information, and then apply that information effectively.
Okay, Mr. Beeman, this next question goes to you first. To what extent do you think law enforcement is burdened by having to deal with issues such as homelessness, untreated mental illness, and youth violence? What do you think law enforcement's role should be in these areas?
Sure, and I would not call that a nuisance. I would just say that it really is not defined very well right now, and it hasn't been defined very well for quite some time. I think that it's very appropriate when a 911 call comes through dispatch, and dispatch is sending people out when the officers arrive on the scene and they've already established the idea that, okay, this could be a mental health crisis. This is a juvenile that's acting out. giving them the tools to contact who they really need to contact in order to kind of diffuse the situation. Law enforcement does a great job every day of diffusing situations. I mean, we're asking them to show up at the most inopportune moments of humanity, when human beings are really at their worst. I say that quite frequently. So their ability to kind of navigate that is good, but it's not a nuisance. The question we have to ask ourselves as a community is, what do we really want law enforcement to do? What do we want them to be? Do we want them to be public safety officers like they are out in Blackman Township in Leone? Should they be firefighters and police officers as well as EMTs? Do we want them to be mental health counselors? We have to really make a decision as to what we want them to be, and then provide them with the resources and the tools that they need and the pay that they need to really perform their duties at the highest level. Most of it is about contact, knowing who to call and knowing how to divert that juvenile, that mental health individual into the right category so we can avoid unnecessary arrest and unnecessary violence against those individuals.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Schutte, would you like the question repeated?
Yes, I would, ma'am.
To what extent do you think law enforcement is burdened by having to deal with issues such as homelessness, untreated mental illness, and youth violence? Also, what do you think law enforcement's role should be in these areas?
Thank you, ma'am. Youth violence, I'm going to talk about this in 3 different parts. I'm going to talk about it in homelessness. Homelessness is certainly a problem. It usually comes, at least in our community, in the form of somebody who is addicted to drugs. And oftentimes they get to a point where, quite frankly, they don't have anywhere else to live. So they're living in the shelter, they're living in the street, or they're living under a bridge, those kinds of things. So it intercedes with law enforcement. It is a burden on law enforcement because they're having to deal with it quite often. And usually it's petty crime and disturbance calls that they have to deal with. When it comes to youth violence, that's a huge burden on law enforcement. There's a tremendous amount of it going on often, and it's increasing in its severity with a lot of gunplay going on with a lot of youths that are minors, and they're dealing with it continuously. And it's very difficult for them to deal with it because, quite frankly, you can't just arrest a minor and then lock them up for a particular crime. There's all sorts of different things that have to be taken into consideration. So the problem often just continues without having a cooling off period. Mental health is something that occurs frequently with police officers dealing with those. So it's a tremendous burden on the police officer as far as having to deal with it. Right now, it's the system that we have. If we do something better, then I'm certain that we would be able to utilize a different resource in the county.
Thank you. Mr. Schutte, you'll be first on this one. Please speak to gun safety and gun violence concerns in our community.
So when I was a detective, one of the things that really concerned me was gun safety. There was a very young boy and another young boy that were involved in finding ammunition that was out in their driveway that had dropped out of a person's gun. And they were hitting the ammunition and ultimately caused one to go off and it exploded. And you would think something like this wouldn't happen, but it did, and severely injured this young boy. That woke me up to the fact that every part of a gun needs to be taken out of the hands of a child, not just the gun itself, but the ammunition, the magazines, everything needs to be taken away from a child so that they're not utilizing it. It's so important. Gun violence in our community has gone up dramatically. I believe Jackson is ranked in the top 5 in the state, cities of its size, for gun violence. That's something that strikes near and dear to my heart because it's something that I was directly involved in lowering during my tenure as a detective. And I'm concerned about how gun violence has continued to get worse and worse through the years. Is safety a real problem with that gun violence? I don't believe it is. I think what's going on is we're not attacking the heart of the problem, and we're not looking at the people that are bringing the guns into the community illegally and focusing on that specifically. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Beeman,
Yes, please.
please speak to gun safety and gun violence concerns in our community.
Sure. Again, it's almost demoralizing the amount of gun violence that is in the Jackson community right now, and what's been happening over the few months. But quite honestly, we're a gun culture. That's part and parcel of being an American. Is we have a Second Amendment right to bear arms. People have very strong feelings about that particular right. So I think the idea that there's going to be less guns in the community, I don't think is really a really realistic viewpoint as to how you ultimately address gun violence. I think what we're talking about when we're talking about gun violence is we're talking about what are the root causes of gun violence. Why are these individuals killing one another? And enforcement definitely plays a role. We definitely want the people that are bringing unregistered ghost guns and other type of guns into our community. We want to know where they're coming from. We want to put those people in jail, and we want to arrest those people. But the question is, the people that are using the guns, why are they using the guns? What exactly is happening? Why are 13-year-old and 14-year-old children being shot in Jackson County by other children? And we have to look at ourselves and figure out, how do we ultimately address that? My immediate response to this is about poverty. That's what it's about. It's about poverty. It's about getting your next meal. It's about a total disregard for human life. It's about individuals who just believe that it's all right to have these behaviors, and we as a community ultimately have to address that. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Beeman, you'll be first on this question. What will be your approach to working with other local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies?
That's actually what I do. And that's actually what I did as the Interstate Deputy Compact Administrators. I coordinated efforts with all 50 states, Puerto Rico, US Virgin Islands, and Guam. My approach is to be open and honest with individuals, to ultimately build a rapport with them. If we're going to go out, and I've had an opportunity to go out in Spring Arbor Township to introduce myself. I've been on Leone Township's board to let them know who I am and kind of give them a baseline of what it is that I'm thinking about the community, because ultimately this is a community. You do that through relationships. I do that through my relationships on the United Way board. Community Solutions Board. I do that as the treasurer of the NAACP. I do that on the board of the Thought One Scholarship Fund. It's about these relationships that you ultimately build with the Jackson Community Foundation, the Hearst Foundation, the Consumers Energy Foundation. These are the relationships that ultimately are going to make the determination so that people can see that we're being consistent and that we're reaching out to their county, their township and areas specifically, so that we can say, what does your community need? Because what Spring Arbor needs is not what Norville needs, and it certainly isn't what Clark Lake needs, or the Columbia area, or Hanover needs. Everyone's area is a little bit different. So I am committed to reaching out to communities, finding out what their specific needs are, and then applying the resources of the Sheriff's Department for their specific needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schutte. Would you like it repeated?
No, ma'am. Thank you. So the sheriff in Jackson County, the sheriff in any county in the state of Michigan, ultimately has a duty as the chief law enforcement officer in that county. And so what that means specifically is that the sheriff has a responsibility to enforce all laws that local communities aren't able to enforce. So for instance, if Blackman Township were tied up on a particular situation, their cars weren't able to respond to a domestic in their jurisdiction, the sheriff's department would have that duty to then respond to that particular location. Same goes for any township that has its own police force. Same goes for any rural township that doesn't have a police force. I'd like to point out that All of the police forces in the county, including the sheriff's department, have all endorsed my candidacy for sheriff because they understand that I know how to work with local law enforcement agencies. I demonstrated that when I was on the Department of Justice Task Force on Violent Crime. So for instance, when I was working on this task force, obviously criminals that are involved in violent crime, involved in criminal behavior, aren't just going to stay in one particular jurisdiction. So it requires communication through all these different jurisdictions. It can be an intricate and complicated web when that kind of thing takes place. So I was able to make sure that I talked with all of these different agencies. We were on the same page, and we were able to orchestrate a net so that we would communicate and make sure that criminal behavior was thwarted before it started.
Thank you. Mr. Schutte, you will be first on this one. There have been some Michigan law enforcement agencies that have voiced refusal to enforce the governor's orders relating to the pandemic. Can you speak to law enforcement agencies refusing to follow executive orders that have the full force of the law?
So it comes down to a circumstance of whether it's right or it's wrong. Now, enforcing the law is something that has been provided to law enforcement officers and given them broad discretion to make a determination as to what is appropriate at the appropriate time. And I want to address it like this. So for instance, if I see as a law enforcement officer somebody speeding down the road and they're going, let's say 5 mile an hour over, and I pull them over and stop them, I have discretion as to whether or not I'm going to give them a ticket for going 5 mile or 10 mile an hour over the speed limit. In this case, I believe that law enforcement officers should also be given broad discretion to make a determination as to whether or not a person should get a misdemeanor citation or be taken to jail for not wearing a mask. Now, I understand people feel very concerned about wearing a mask and why they feel so concerned about wearing a mask. I totally get that. And I understand that the executive order provides for a misdemeanor penalty. I think that's too harsh. Nevertheless, it's the law. It has to be followed right now, and people have to make sure that they follow the law. Now, I would allow the deputies, just like I would in any other situation, broad discretion as to whether or not they're going to enforce the law with a misdemeanor citation. I certainly wouldn't want them arresting anybody and bringing them into the confines of the jail and exposing them to additional people that could also exacerbate the problem. So it's kind of a strange law to me. I think it could be enforced and done in different ways, but I do believe that it's important that the law enforcement officers enforce the law as it is written. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like it repeated, Mr. Beeman?
Yes, please.
There have been some Michigan law enforcement agencies that have voiced refusal to enforce the governor's orders relating to the pandemic. Can you speak to law enforcement agencies refusing to follow executive orders that have the full force of the law?
Sure, absolutely. I just want to make sure that I heard kind of how you were saying the ultimate question. I think this is one of the reasons that I'm running as an independent candidate in this election, is because of my true feelings and my true belief that law enforcement, there's no place for partisanship in ultimately law enforcement. Law enforcement should never be caught in the middle between the games of legislatures or of the games of politicians in making determinations as to whether or not we're going to follow laws or we're not going to follow laws. The laws are on the book for a reason. Does that mean that I have any desire to run around, have deputies running around writing tickets for individuals not wearing masks? Absolutely not. But the Constitution is clear who the governor is, whether that governor be Republican, whether that governor be a Democrat, whether that governor be an independent, a libertarian, or the Green Party. Ultimately should be irrelevant to the purview of the sheriff. The sheriff's job is to support his officers in what they're doing. And as Mr. Schutte said, there's a variety of different discretion that is afforded to law enforcement, and I would take my deputies' decision to at their discretion 100% at their word. But what I will not tolerate is an individual saying they will openly defy the governor of the state of Michigan based on some political viewpoint that's ultimately happening. Thank you.
Okay, that concludes the formal questioning of the forum. And now you'll each have an opportunity to give your closing statement. And you'll have 90 seconds as well to do this. And Mr. Schutte, you may go first.
Thank you, ma'am. What I'd like to point out here is that obviously there's two different points of view, and that what I represent is law enforcement, 25 years of experience, and a tremendous amount of experience battling violent crime in our community. And I've had a tremendous amount of success in doing so. In addition to that, I never trampled on anybody's Second Amendment rights. And I was always successful in bringing in large criminal conspiracies that were involved in a tremendous amount of breaking and enterings and shootings and violent crimes in our community. I believe that I have made our community safer during that tenure. What I look to do as sheriff is to continue with that and to teach the deputies and to teach everyone in the county that I come into contact with the appropriate way of combating this type of criminal activity and criminal behavior. I will do it so that everyone is equally represented. I will ensure that no one's rights are trampled on. I will be particularly sensitive to the minority communities in our area, and I will make sure that everyone is represented equally at the jail. And what I mean by that specifically is I'm going to be certain that our population at the Jackson County Sheriff's Department is going to be reflective of the population in Jackson County so that the minorities are represented within the ranks of the Sheriff's Department. Thank you.
Mr. Beeman, you may now have your 90 seconds for closing comment as well.
Thank you very much. Again, thank the league for putting this on. It's been excellent. I'm gonna pivot a little bit because I agree 100%. The Sheriff's Department has a duty to the citizens of Jackson County to enforce the law, and we should do that at the highest level that we possibly can, making arrests and conducting investigations. But I'm gonna pivot a little bit because part and parcel to that, and extraordinarily part of that, is law enforcement is like fixing, it's like a short-term fix. You kind of fix what's happening. I'm a firm believer in the prospect of investing in people. So I would say to look in the jail system, to see what we have individuals in there, up to 12 months or not up to 12 months. How can we ultimately, in concert with the district court probation, in concert with evidence-based programming, break the cycle of criminal behavior? Because we already know that by investing in people and communities, to address issues like poverty, lack of employable skills, substance abuse, mental health, and education, that we can make communities safer over the long term as well. So while we're doing law enforcement activities in the community, we need to also be figuring out how do we plan for the long-term success of individuals to make our communities truly successful. Because the other thing that we know is that when we invest in people, and the people that are basically in the churn of the criminal justice system begin to become more successful, the community becomes more successful and ultimately more prosperous economically, livability. All of these things are kind of part and parcel with each other. So I would pledge that promise whatsoever. We will continue law enforcement, but we will turn to pivot to invest in people, district court level and the county jail level, to make our community safer in the long term. Thank you.
That concludes our candidate forum, and I'd like to thank both of you for your participation, and also particularly thank you for following the rules and your participation in this valuable process. I'll now turn this over to Ms. Clark for closing comments.
Well, our community is very fortunate to have two such talented candidates to choose from for county sheriff. And the league wishes to thank you, both of you, for participating in this candidate forum, and to thank all who contributed questions. All our candidate forums will be available for streaming on your computer or smartphone. Go to our website, lwvjackson.org, and look for the link to the forum. In addition, the forum can be found at vote411.org. Please urge your friends and fellow voters to watch these forums. We encourage you to call one of the Jackson District Library branches to make arrangements to pick up a print copy of the 2020 League of Women Voters Voter Guide. You can also stop by Winsler Dry Cleaners on Morrell Street at Brown Street to pick up a copy. We will be distributing them to other sites in the Jackson area as well, and they will be available beginning September 25th. For additional nonpartisan information on federal, state, and local candidates and ballot issues, go to 411.org, vote411.org. For 18 years, this has been the League of Women Voters online resource guide covering local, state, and federal candidates and current proposals that will appear on your ballot. With the passage of Proposal 3 in 2018, all Michigan voters are eligible to cast an absentee ballot. If you are planning to vote by absentee ballot, be sure that you return it as soon as possible. You can take your ballot directly to your clerk's office for your precinct or district. And if you're not sure where your clerk's office is, call your city or township office. They will be able to direct you to the correct place. You must take the ballot to the correct clerk's office. Many now also have drop boxes at their locations for absentee ballots. If you're planning to mail your ballot, be sure that you sign the envelope inside the box, include the correct amount of postage stamps, and mail it early. In addition, while voters are encouraged to register ahead of time, Michigan law now provides for same-day voter registration and voting. Remember, no matter if you vote in person or by absentee ballot, make sure you vote in the November election. Thank you.